Hello and welcome to Devex at WHA 75. We're here on the ground in Geneva, and today I'm delighted to be joined by Lucien Foster, who's the head of health partnerships at Meta. And Meta is the umbrella company that obviously includes social media platforms like Facebook, WhatsApp, and Instagram. And technology has found itself at the middle of the pandemic. You've also found yourself responding to the crisis. So I'd just like to, kick off by asking you, what was the defining COVID moment for you at Meta, and how did you sort of start responding to it?
It's a great question, and I'm really excited to be here, Amruta, so thank you.
Thank you.
So it's actually, we were actually on the ground, I guess, a little bit earlier than I think folks might have thought. So when the WHO declared an emergency, we actually had a strategy set forward. One thing that I think a lot of people don't realize about Meta is that we've actually been working on health for the last 5 years. So 5 years ago, we actually launched a blood donations tool on Facebook, and we first launched in India. And that tool allowed people to find blood banks and connect with blood banks and be able to solicit blood. And so through that, we had worked with many partners. It's actually in over 40 countries now, if you can imagine. Right. So we worked with various blood banks and governments and partners. And so we had this great network. And we also knew that our platforms, specifically Facebook, Instagram, and WhatsApp, were really great vehicles for people to be able to access information. And so it started there. And so we knew we had a great platform that could help reach people. And then we also knew that we had a network of people that we could rely on to get expert and reliable information out there.
Right, that's great. So you already had some sort of a structure that you could leverage. And you just spoke about information, and that has been sort of like the key factor in this pandemic in sort of trying to reach people, in trying to make them understand what is going on, because things were also changing so fast. So how did Meta respond to evolving information, as it were?
I mean, that's the thing. It was such a challenge, right? It was, I think, the entire world, was trying to evolve and understand what was being brought to them and the information that was out there. And so it was a critical thing for us. We knew we had experts and partners, and we're not an expert, right? And so that was the thing that was really important to us, was how do we bring access to expert, academic, reliable information quickly? And we knew we had to leverage a partner set, and it shouldn't be from our voice. But I think one thing that I actually want to take a step back on first is just the importance of accurate and reliable information, because I think we take it a little bit for granted. So one thing we know is that in the absence of good information, misinformation can thrive.
Right.
And so actually providing access to good information is really, it's part of a tactic, right? If you're going to address misinformation, we knew that we had to provide reliable, accurate information, and you also have to remove the misinformation. And I think the challenges with misinformation specifically is it's actually not as prevalent as we think about it sometimes, because misinformation can be, I can cure COVID with bleach.
Right.
But a lot of the things that you see on a platform are much more opinion-based. And so what you'll see is, oh, I got a COVID vaccine and I have a headache. Or the COVID vaccine is causing blood clots. And so because there's so much more of information of that, people need context to understand and be able to associate of, okay, how do I determine this validity? Because the things to remove are easy, right? COVID can be cured by bleach. But starting to build context and help someone understand of, okay, there was an opinion or a fact out there that people might have thought as a fact. How do I determine the accuracy of that? And that's why the accurate and reliable information is so important, because it brings people that context, and they can then make the decision for themselves. And so, that was really, we knew accurate and reliable information was important. So the first thing, we did is, I think one of the things we're most proud of is we have a COVID information center. We made that available on Facebook and Instagram. And that was bringing accurate and reliable information up to the center so people could see it in their news feeds, see it in the platforms where they already were.
Right.
The other thing that we did is we actually worked with many of our partners, right? And we were able to give over $100 million in ad credits. And what that did was it allowed partners of ours and this expert information to come out across the ads platform and reach over 80 billion people in impressions. So just that wide, vast amount. And that really was the first thing, and kind of one of the biggest, not only one of a challenge, but a way for us to activate.
Right, right. It's really interesting to me that you bring up the idea of, opinions that are misinformation based, but also, just statements that are put out there. So as a company and, working across different platforms, how did you sort of, differentiate between the two? And also, what were sort of the mechanisms that were put in place to remove some of these posts, and also kind of, again, trying to, I guess, divert them in the right direction?
Yes, so we have a global fact-checking across many different languages. That was one thing in order to be able to identify. One thing that we've also done is worked with experts to specifically help us validate. And again, like misinformation, it has to be misinformation. It's something to be debunked by academic experts.
Yeah.
And so that's another element that we put in place. So those and then, stringent content policies have been really kind of key. But again, I always want to go back to, that is removing. The harder thing is actually getting the accurate and reliable information out there so people can make those decisions for themselves.
Right, right. That's really interesting. And then, that also brings us to how do you put out this reliable information? And you said, you're not the experts. You work with the other experts. So did you also find yourself in this tricky position of trying to, be the arbiter of truth in some way, and trying to, again, like, how did you partner with different organizations? How did you choose who to partner with, and how did that sort of process evolve over time?
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. We are not the arbiter of truth. We are not experts in the space. And so what we did is, again, going back to the blood donations, we had so many great partners that we worked with, like the WHO, who had been partners with us for the last couple of years. And we were able to work with them and understand what was, one of the great things about the $100 million in ad credits was these partners were able to take the information and then push the information out there, and through our ads platform able to measure it, right? Measure what was the information that was resonating, understand who the right trusted messengers were for that information, and be able to actually measure the benefit and the influence that the information had.
Right, right. That's so interesting that you bring up the point of measurement. So how did that process work, and do we have some examples that we can share?
Yes. So, when we talk about measurement, it was measurement that was already within our ads measurement platform. It's called Brand Lift. And some of the things that we found using that was, for example, in certain countries like the Philippines, I think public health officials there found that actually the trusted messengers were healthcare workers. Or another example that we saw was that in certain markets, right, when you think about information, which were the platforms that were going to work? And so one thing that was really interesting was to find out that we worked with so many governments to enable WhatsApp chatbots, right? So that people could get information. There's some information that you want to inquire from a chatbot, and other information that you might see within an ad. So being able to understand what was things that people needed on demand versus things that they wanted to get more information and read about and have more context, or I just want to know where to get a vaccine.
Yeah, yeah. And how did you, again, sort of decide which program works for which country? Because if there's one thing that we've learned from the pandemic is that not every country, not every region even within countries reacts in the same way to both information and to the situation of the day. So how did you decide that, and were there different programs that you then had to run in different countries?
Yes, so there's actually a great example of this. So we did when I think of the last 2 years, we knew we had a responsibility, and I think the biggest responsibility was to test and learn and then share our learnings out. And so one of the areas that I thought was really interesting was, we were kind of speculating, trying to build lots of tools. One thing we built was the vaccine finder, and so we had launched this in the US. It was a tool as the vaccines came out to be able to locate where to get a vaccine. And it was incredibly impactful in the US. But when we looked at the tool and we looked at what it brought, which was, being able to collate and understand what location, what store, what provider, center, it was something that was perhaps not applicable to every other country, because you think about other countries, the access to care is a little bit more directed. Yeah. And so we were like, oh, well, this is something, as we measured the viability of it going to another country, this isn't something that we could actually scale. Right. And so there was a lot of that, of testing and learning. But then again, sharing that, because, when we had talked about Vaccine Finder, everyone was like, oh, that sounds really interesting. But when you shared out of like, this is actually where it works and where it may not work. Right, and it won't work in different countries, because in a lot of the other countries, the Ministry of Health just decides, and it's sort of taken care of by the government. So you sort of have to see where the gaps are and where you can come in as a tech company. Yes.
That's really interesting. And then, that also speaks to kind of meeting people where they are, right? And that also speaks to sort of knowing who your audience is and knowing who the influencers are. So, and I know that, there have been some really big influencer campaigns that you have run. So how did you decide that, and how, take us sort of behind the scenes a little bit?
To be honest, I would say we didn't decide. Again, working with a lot of the partners, we were able to run measurement campaigns and to see who were the right messengers for various populations. So for example, the one that I just stated on the Philippines is that they realized that it was healthcare workers. In some parts of the US, we found that faith leaders were important. It was really about having, basically putting a lot of ideas out there and then starting to test. And I think the biggest thing was then being able to test. And what we would do is we would publish out the insights by country, to the partners that we were working with. So we developed insights reports across many different countries, and then we would send them out to partners, share these learnings, share learnings on calls with them, so that they could take that information and quickly kind of pivot. The other thing that is interesting too is, within the ads platform, one of the expectations of being in Facebook and Instagram is that things are customized to you.
Right.
And so I think that there was almost just a natural expectation for people as if you're going to be giving me information, if you're going to be serving me ads, I expect it to be personalized. I expect the message to resonate.
Yeah.
And so sharing those learnings, because that was a challenge, right? Information was changing. We needed to get accurate and reliable information there. We needed to make sure that the right trusted messengers were giving the information. And all of this is happening with, to be honest, social media is something new for public health. We haven't used it as much before. And so testing, learning, sharing those insights, I think it's a great path forward. So.
Yeah, no, that sounds really exciting, and also for the partners that are involved. So could you talk a little bit about, what is the way forward, and what do some of these partnerships look like going forward? And we're here at the World Health Assembly, so what are some of the things that you're expecting at the Assembly as well?
So, I talked a lot about access to information and reliable information, and I think one thing we realized is the platform can actually have something to contribute in access to support and access to care. And so one thing that we learned, and this is something I'm really excited to kind of further invest in, and Meta is excited to further invest in, is this access to support. So one thing that was so interesting was, especially as many of us were, in our homes, quarantined, people turned to Facebook for communities. Right. And so a lot of communities spun up. So for example, there was a community that was already live that was Katie Morton is a licensed therapist, and she was able to offer mental health, and her community grew during the pandemic. Similarly, there was a community that stood up that was for people of dealing with long COVID, right? So this is kind of more towards the end of the pandemic. There's over 150,000 people in this global community. It's called Survivor Corps, where people were able to share their experiences, connect with other people, really get that support, and then within that, be able to have researchers kind of see what's going on within that group and almost have some validation of the impact that they were having from COVID. So that access to support is one area that we definitely want to pursue and start understanding more community groups that are on, and people that are able to get support on Facebook within these. The second thing is this access to care. So I had mentioned the WhatsApp chatbots, and lots of governments had enabled WhatsApp chatbots for information. There were some, for example, in Indonesia, where they enabled the chatbots to actually help people find the vaccine and schedule the vaccine appointment. So if you can think about this, and what it ended up being was that I think it was over a third of the country's healthcare workers scheduled their appointments within 5 days. Right. So you think about just that access to care is so quick, and that you can start using things like chatbots to help direct people, have them schedule appointments. It's really exciting. So we think of further partnerships where we want to start investing more in that space.
Right, right. That is really exciting, and we will be watching what you do, and we will be watching the partnerships that you end up forging through the pandemic and even beyond. Thank you so much, Luchan, for this candid conversation. We look forward to talking to you again.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.